Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I'm going to be giving you my first look at the statistics of the M-V-Y. This is an upcoming Tier 10 American Heavy tank, which will be the crown of the new YOH tech tree. The selling point of this tech tree will be that starting from Tier 7, they have a set of reserve tracks that you can see at the back. I've talked about this before, so if you want to know my full opinion about this, check out that video. The short story will be that even if you lose your main track, you have this auxiliary track that will allow you to keep moving, albeit at a slower rate, meaning that you're going to be harder to lock down, it's going to be easy for you to pull back round a corner, and it also brings up lots of funky opportunities, like maybe not even using a repair kit on the vehicle to begin with at all. So before I get stuck into the statistics of the M-V-Y and break those down in comparison to other American heavy tanks, we've got some lovely screenshots here that we can use to take a look at the peculiarities of this thing's armor. So firstly, this machine gun on the side. There's one to the left and one to the right of the vehicle. This looks like it's going to be a fairly flat target. Does this mean that from the front that the upper hull is actually going to have a weak point? Or when the vehicle tries to side scrape, that this will be a bit of a flat surface? But I'm going into the nitty-gritty details before just having an overall look at this thing's armor. Man, it does look, the Reddit memes were right, with sort of this kind of like Jar Jar Binks head, or something like an alien queen from James Cameron's second part of my favorite franchise when it comes to films. On top, we do have a bit of a cupola, but when this vehicle is using its gun depression, then it's probably going to be a little bit more tricky to be able to see that. Although, when I consider that it looks like the gun is completely linked to the turret, in theory, if it's not able to tip its gun down at all, then that weak point will be visible from all angles. One thing that alarms me about looking at the side of this tank is it does look very flat. One of the best things, as I highlighted in my video yesterday about some of the top tier American tanks, is that their hulls are very angled over the side, meaning that you can over-angle the side armor to try and bait your opponents into not shooting your hull. The front looks a lot like a T110E5, which is a good thing, but we're going to have to wait to see just how thick it is later on. So we've got a few more screenshots. This is the vehicle from the back, a very fetching external fuel tank there. We can see again from this angle it does look very flat, and even this boxy shape on the back will be a pain to try and hide if you're side scraping in this tank. We've even got a better top-down view here at just how flat that side armor could be, but I really need to get it onto Tanks GG to draw that final conclusion. And this is the angle that really does concern me with regards to that machine gun port, and also with the side of the turret here. When you're side scraping out from this kind of an angle, I could imagine that this might be a bit of a weak point, especially against high explosive anti-tank rounds, and maybe they'll even be able to catch that flat machine gun port from the side. We'll have to see how Wargaming is going to balance it out, but once again, this vehicle seems to be all about that glorious turret on top and being able to sit hull down against your opponents and to truly mess them up. One final mention I want to make is just how weird it is to have a turret that seems to be an independent unit compared to the hull on this vehicle, just literally mounted on this support bracket here. What a bizarre design. Does look very modern, and I guess whether you think it fits inside the game is just a matter of opinion. Alright, so the M-V-Y, I have the statistics here, and the first things to draw is that it does have a 4-person crew, and so if you're trying to prepare a crew for this line, then you want a commander, a driver, a gunner, and a loader. Very standard there. And it looks like Wargaming are trialing 2 guns on this vehicle. Now, in the forward that they provided, Wargaming suggested that they're going to see which gun is best to be able to put on the tank. Wargaming, why don't you just put both guns on the tank if you're going to be investing development time into them? It's always nice to have options, even on top tier tanks, a lot like on the recent VZ55, where you could play that thing with the autoloader or the single shot gun. Plus, from a monetization department, just think how much you can make people grind on their tier 10s or to convert free experience using gold. So in true QuickyBaby fashion, this information is confusing to me, so I decided to put it up onto Excel so we can see it side by side, and so importantly, we can also see how the vehicle stacks up compared to its tier 10 competition in the form of the T110E5. So on the left, we will have the M-V-Y with the 105mm, in the middle, the M-V-Y with the 120mm gun, and then the good old classic tier 10 American heavy tank, not the T30, right? The T110E5. So right off the bat, we see that this 105mm has 360 alpha damage, while the 120mm has 440. meaning that it has 40 more and 40 less than the regular 120 on the T110E5. Clearly, Wargaming are trying as hard as they can to make this vehicle different to the T110E5. They don't want to put just another T110E5 into the game that has auxiliary tracks, and so having a different alpha damage is always a way to be able to mix it up. Alright, so 360 alpha damage. It's not very good for a tier 10 heavy, but considering it works on the STB1, as long as the M5Y has some gun depression and spoilers it does, then you should be able to consistently keep up the fight on a ridgeline. One nice thing about 360 alpha damage with a vehicle like this, considering that the rate of fire is excellent with the 105mm at 7.69 nice rounds a minute, then that should easily allow you to be able to link multiple shots in for every time the enemy fires. Consider that you're fighting against a T110E5, for example. You have nearly a round a minute extra, so you should be able to fire twice and be able to pull back, hopefully doing 720 damage to the T110E5 while only taking 400 damage from them. However, it kind of comes a bit skewed up when you might be fighting against something like an E100 or even a 60 TP using the large caliber gun. Then, even if you shoot them twice for 720, they're going to be doing 750 damage to you, if of course they're able to penetrate you. The damage per minute, if you do use this 105mm gun, is very impressive at 2,769, which trumps vehicles like the WZ-111-5A, and even just a touch better than the T110E5, although it's negligible. With this 105mm gun, you get APCR rounds as your standard ammunition with 268mm of penetration and 315mm of high explosive anti-tank. Now, if you want to use the larger caliber gun, the 120mm that deals 440 alpha damage, you're going to have way better high explosive rounds with 530 alpha damage and 60mm of pen, but your standard ammunition is down to 252. It's not great for tier 10, and your gold penetration, as it stands, is at a paltry 300mm of penetration, which really will struggle against those top tier tanks. It also should be mentioned that the standard ammunition on the 120 is armor piercing rounds, so you're undoubtedly going to have worse shell velocity, which can impact engaging your opponents at decent distances. So for the alpha damage advantage of going up to 440, your rate of fire suffers, as you would expect, but significantly so, nearly 2 rounds a minute, meaning that the damage per minute of this vehicle is down to 2,514. To put that into perspective, a vehicle like the WZ-111-5A with 490 alpha damage actually has just over 2,600 damage per minute, meaning that the M5Y will be substantially behind that vehicle, even though it has less alpha damage. The way that I look at it is that if Wargaming want to put the M5Y in with the 120mm, they clearly just don't want to make it like a Chieftain, which has 440 alpha damage, or like a better Super Conqueror. Higher alpha damage does have to have a drawback, but when there are already vehicles in the game with 7 degrees of gun depression, albeit with better DPM and better alpha damage and much better high explosive anti-tank rounds, looking at this, I personally would probably play the M5Y with the 105mm. But again, Wargaming, please give us both guns on the vehicle, albeit both balanced, and leave the decision to the player. All right, so let's move on to gun handling. The 105mm has 0.35 accuracy, while the 120 has 0.38. Not great. And in fact, the 105mm here is identical to the T110E5's 120mm, but the vehicle does have 10 degrees of gun depression. That's lovely. It's a lot like a Super Conqueror. On a ridgeline, it's going to be truly dominant. The 120mm on this tank does have a half a second worse aim time, but considering you're hitting substantially harder, you would expect that. Again, a slight advantage for the 105mm, but a lot of players out there will be thinking that alpha damage is king, and yeah, I would agree with that to an extent. So now let's take a look at the mobility for the M5Y. Interesting enough, Wargaming only provided us with one set of mobility statistics, and considering that it has 2 different guns, I would probably expect that they weigh different amounts. With that consideration, the M5Y has an impressive 750 horsepower engine, which gives it a power to weight ratio, considering the vehicle weighs just over 40 tons, of 18.4. This makes even the grunt in the engine, the impressive grunt in the T110E5's engine, look fairly weak. Combine this with a better top speed of 40 kilometers an hour, and for some reason, a top speed limit, I just got to check that I haven't made a mistake here, of yes, 25 kilometers an hour backwards. Wargaming seem to really want this thing to be able to pull back over a ridgeline quickly. That's over double that of the T110E5, and that allows this vehicle to go faster backwards than quite a few heavy tanks can even. Well, one heavy tank can even go forwards. I'm looking at you, Mr. Mouse. This immediately sets off alarm bells in my head. Why, Wargaming, do we once again need vehicles which are incredibly strong on a ridgeline with incredibly good damage per minute, with also very good power to weight ratios? This tank is, to all intents and purposes, a medium tank, albeit that it's limited to 40. But depending on what field mods this vehicle gets, we could be seeing that get pumped up to 44. And with a turbo and a slot, that could be reaching 49 kilometers an hour. And this vehicle definitely has the power to weight ratio to make use of that, albeit if the ground resistances are good. But you can improve that with field mods as well. Moving on, let's take a look at the armor of this vehicle. 178 on the front of the hull is not terrible, but it's probably not going to hold up too many rounds unless they're bouncing off the upper plate and you're using a little bit of the gun depression that the vehicle has. The side armor, however, very nice at 89. Kind of worries me, however, that it might not be very well angled. If it's not very well angled, then you're not going to want to over-angle the armor. However, the T110E5 with its 76 millimeters of side armor can actually be over-angled to try and bait your opponents into shooting it, a lot like the M48A5 pattern. So it's kind of concerning for me with the M5Y with regards to the hull armor on this tank. It could be pretty awful, but one thing that definitely isn't going to be awful is this chunky turret. 356 millimeters of protection on the turret. The only thing that really alarms me is that the side, if your opponents do catch you, might not be the best, as it is 102 millimeters thick. And unlike a Super Conqueror, for example, which has space protection, this thing could fall short, a lot like on the Rinoceronte as well. A passing mention should be made to the vehicle's standard 2,200 hit points and standard 400 meters view range, which means that this vehicle will not need coated optics with good crew skills. All you need is vents on this thing, situational awareness, recon, brothers in arms, and possibly even the field mod that increases your view range as well, and you will be able to spot your opponents at decent distances. And considering how important equipment slots are now, to be able to free up coated optics is definitely an advantage. So all in all, it's clear that Wargaming want this vehicle to be able to expose its turret on a ridgeline, to have the speed to be able to get to the ridgeline, to be able to quickly fall back from the ridgeline, and to have damage per minute to be oppressive when it's there. The M5Y, as it's shaping up, looks as if it's pretty much going to be a Super Conqueror that is faster, while also still having the reserve tracks on this vehicle to make it even harder to stop this tank. The M5Y, well, it looks great. It also does make me question why every vehicle going into the game has to be super fast, why every vehicle going into the game has to have such an awesome turret, and why Wargaming even seem to be hell-bent on taking away fundamentals like being able to incapacitate the mobility of your opponents, especially if you're in lower tier tanks, to stop them from grinding you out with incredible damage per minute. Nevertheless, there are enough irregularities with this thing's armor to pose a number of questions. And whether this thing is truly going to be able to find itself in the ultimate hold down god tier position enough to justify its strengths remains to be seen. Nevertheless, as we've seen very clearly inside the ranked meta, which is also slowly slipping its way into the random queue as well, hold down monsters like the Kranfang are about as good as it gets in World of Tanks. And if this vehicle stays with the statistics that it has, or even if they get a little bit better, let me clarify once again, everything that you've seen is in the super test right now and subject to change before we probably see it on the common test server, maybe in December. Then the M5Y is certainly looking like a bit of a monster heavy to be able to look forward to. And if you want to prepare for this tank, then as I highlighted a month ago, God, look at that crew position in that vehicle. It's just absolutely bizarre. Then make sure that you are unchecking accelerated crew training in your T1 Heavy so you can be ready for the tanks right from the get-go. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that's it for today. Really hope you enjoyed this look at the upcoming jewel of the new YOH line crown. If you did, give the video a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Let me know what you think about this tank in the comments. Do you think it looks outrageously good? Do you think that it looks outrageously weird? Or do you think that it looks just about right? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.